like we're hitting the mark on the time, so we want to get started here. Welcome everyone. Intertribal Agriculture Council's webinar series for Wednesday. And today we have Philomena Kebec to talk. I'm sorry, excuse me, just 1 second.
I'm just gonna jump in quick and give a couple quick updates. My name's Dan Cornelius. I also work for Intertribal Agriculture Council, and excited to announce we have a couple of additions to the schedule. At 9 o'clock tomorrow Mountain Time, we have a virtual tour of the Oneida Cannery from Jamie Betters. So keep an eye on the intertribalfoodsummit.com website or our Facebook page. And we'll have more information on that. We're also adding a really exciting panel on harvesting foraging with, we've got Linda Blackelk, Greg Johnson, Marty Reinhardt, and Valerie Segrest. That is on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock Mountain Time. So going to be a pretty nice transition from the week of activities going into the weekend with that panel. I'll turn it back over to TCON.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. I'm really excited for everything that's been happening. I'm new to the organization, about a month in, and so this has been a great opportunity to learn about the amazing work that's happening around the nation. So I'm just so grateful for this event and to be a participant and helping to moderate this session today. So thank you. So we just really wanted to put out the call to action to those who are listening. At Intertribal Agriculture Council, we do a lot of advocacy, and there's a lot of resources available through our website. If you go to our website, COVID-19 resources, which is up on the screen currently, you can see there are different template letters and draft resolutions and narratives to talk to your different legislation and lawmakers in your region. We're also collecting information on our surveys, and that really helps us to do some of that advocacy at a national level. We use that information to inform the lawmakers and really demonstrate where the needs are and where improvements can be made to make meaningful change for agriculture in Indian country. So please, if you are a producer or a tribal community leader, or if you're a grocer, food hub, or a cooperative, or you're involved in the American Indian Food label available through IAC, please take the survey, share your information, and help us provide the resources that are needed. Beyond that, we have a whole bunch of available items, if you keep going down on that resource page, tons of information on the available grants that are being made possible by the government and ways to navigate it and just how to. So please check that out and use it and support yourself and your community by engaging with these different programs. So today we have a great speaker, Philomena Kebec, and she's going to be talking about the wonderful stuff that she's been doing in her region to help and create a draft food code that can help to inform the work that we're doing nationwide. So Philomena Kebec belongs to the Bad River Band of Lake Siberia, Chippewa, and is a 2008 graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. She currently serves as the policy analyst for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission for Treaty Rights and Implementation. Thank you so much, Philomena Kebec, for being here with us and sharing your knowledge.
I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you guys, and I'm just honored and humbled to participate in this program. Sean, I was listening to Sean's presentation, and he's just fantastic. Linda Linda Black Elk is a friend of mine, and I'm just so impressed by both of those, food activists and food workers. And so it's wonderful to be here today. What I'm going to be doing is talking about our food regulatory project that we've been working on for 2 years. And I'll give you, oops, sorry about that. I always kind of mess up when I first get started on these computer things. So what I want to do is just provide you with a kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So first I'm going to talk about just a snapshot of the project, what the goals and objectives are. And then we're going to be taking a look at sort of the basics related to Anishinaabe governance, economy and foodways in, pre-colonial and then sort of post-colonial times. We'll be talking about treaties with the United States and how the tribes really had to fight to vindicate their treaty rights and affirm tribal sovereignty in court and through lawmaking. And then all that together, I'm going to describe the process that was used to develop the model food codes using maple syrup as the example. So just some background, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission has been around since 1984. We work with 11 Ojibwe tribes in the Upper Great Lakes region. We have several different divisions, and I'm part of the Division of Intergovernmental Affairs. We're really heavy into science, and so certainly have a really strong team of scientists that work on a number of different fisheries, wildlife issues, environmental issues, and then we've recently moved into climate change as an area of focus. Okay, so this particular project is funded through the Administration of Native Americans under its SEBS program. It's a 3-year project and we're in year 3. So the overall goals of the project are really about providing access to our tribes, our tribal communities and programs, access to traditional wild harvested foods. And, also in turn, providing economic opportunities for small businesses based on treaty harvested foods. And so value added products made from these wild harvested foods. How we're doing that, how we're approaching this project and these goals is to create a model food processing code for these traditional foods. And then all the governmental implementation tools that are needed to really implement it. So reports on food safety, hazard analysis, critical control point plans, and then like standardized sanitation operating procedures, GMPs on traditional food processing, and then training for harvesters and governmental staff. So it's really, the overall process, the overall goal is to expand tribal sovereignty over these particular areas and create a regulatory framework that these foods can be, available for our programs and available for our communities, or more available, I should say. So, GLFWIC, we're not creating law by this project, and I want to just make that clear. We're providing technical assistance to the tribes that we work with. We're like IAC, we provide technical assistance. We don't make law. Tribal governments are the bodies that really make and enforce tribal law. And this project isn't meant to impact the kinds of food consuming and food processing activities that are already going on in our communities. So we have cultural feasts and community feasts and maybe somebody else can answer that question. We have a lot of activities that go around these foods all the time because they're so important to our traditional culture. This isn't really about affecting that in any way except possibly making these foods more available for people. And it's really not about regulating the informal food sales that are already going on in our communities or home use. But what's missing in our communities is that treaty harvested foods are not available to be served in a regular basis within federally funded programs. They're not available. Most of them are not available in restaurants or grocery stores. My son goes to the Bad River Head Start program, and you know, we're right in the heart of Ojibwe country in Bad River, Odena, and our community is, we do a tremendous amount of deer harvesting and fish harvesting and wild rice and all kinds of really healthy superfoods. But my in my son's Head Start program, they're really confined to serving kids foods like hot dogs and tater tots and macaroni, and you know, our traditional foods that have been sustaining us for a long time are generally not available. And so that's, you know, that's a real problem. Goodness. Okay. So, you know, foods are central to the development of our people as a separate and distinct people. And to provide you with just a little bit of background into our communities, you know, our Ojibwe communities, allied with the Odawa and Potawatomi, many, like hundreds of years ago, to form the Anishinaabe Nation, the Three Fires Alliance, that had similar culture, language, traditions, law, and really governed this area in the Upper Great Lakes region for many centuries. And this is a much longer period of time than the European or American culture has been within this particular area. And so obviously in any nation, food production, how you feed your people is incredibly important. And if we weren't able to feed our people, we would not have survived. And, you know, for Ojibwe people, the collection and harvest of wild food within our region is, it's how we keep time, and it's how we, you know, how we regulate our entire existence. So there's this idea of the seasonal rounds, and the seasonal rounds is really, what are you supposed to be doing at this particular season? Where are you supposed to be living? Where are you supposed to be harvesting from? And, you know, it's in the springtime, it's all about harvesting maple syrup and harvesting maple sap and making sugar, and then harvesting fish that are spawning. And then people move to different areas, move to ricing beds when rice is available, and move to areas where berries are available. And then in the wintertime and fall, move back into hunting camps. And so like the whole seasonal rounds is the way that we've really oriented ourselves as people. And it's all been about the collection of food. And in those, you know, in those times before the colonial period, food collection and harvesting food and processing food wasn't as difficult because there was such an abundance of resources. And it's really different now because there's a really different way that this, you know, the colonial government deals with land management and thinks about food and food production. Food really, for Anishinaabe people, is thought about as a gift from the creator. And it's not used as a way to punish people or differentiate poor people from rich people. You know, food is really seen as absolutely necessary, and it's still seen as necessary. Specific foods, our ceremonial foods, are absolutely necessary for feasting and ceremony, which are like, that's another way that time is marked through a person's life, through feasting with these particular foods that have been harvested, and then ceremony, and respecting that gift, and really honoring what it means to be an Anishinaabe person. So, the culture around food and these food ways stem from Anishinaabe Inakonigewin, our traditional law. And these are the original instructions, and the original treaties that were created were not the treaties that were made with the United States. People talk about the treaties being violated. The original treaties are the treaties with the Creator, and those treaties still stand today. And so our belief as Anishinaabe is that everyone within creation, all beings within creation received instructions about how they're supposed to live. And so I'm looking out my window and I see my maple tree, and the maple tree received instructions about how it's supposed to live, and have green leaves this time of year, and grow up to be tall and strong and produce sap in the spring. And maple trees live up to their instructions. They continue to follow those original instructions from the Creator. People also received original instructions, and these are law, these are responsibilities that we have to, continue to follow in order to maintain our identity as a people, and to be strong, and to exist. And so these responsibilities relate to the sovereignty that we have as Anishinaabe, and relate to our treaty rights and our rights to be within our traditional territories. And so all these things together are thought of as Minobamataziwin. That's kind of a concept that we talk about a lot within our communities. Many of these instructions that we have as people relate to traditional foods. And so, there's a Waynaboozhoo story about maple syrup. And, I'm not like going to go into the entire story or anything, because there's just not time to talk about that. But basically the story is about how Waynaboozhoo found the Anishinaabe just, at one time, the syrup came right from the tree. And the people got really lazy, and Waynaboozhoo saw that. And so there was a change that happened within the instruction of the maple tree, and the syrup became less, or the sugar content was reduced, because people needed to work to make the food and really appreciate this gift from the Creator. So you can see in this picture, this is one of our community members, Jerome Paulus, hauling maple sap, and it's a lot of work to make syrup. But maple sugar and syrup, and the way to process this particular food, derives from Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous food science knowledge. And it's really important. I'm going to come back to this several times during this presentation, but at a certain point, the United States became really rich and powerful. And how the United States became rich and powerful is because of the subjugation of other people through, it's enslaving and forced labor and removing people from the African continent, and and then also imposing all kinds of brutality against Indigenous people who were in the South and eastern portion of the United States. At a certain point, the United States came to want land further west within this continent, and started talking to the Indigenous people, or engaging warfare against Indigenous people towards our part of the world. And so our leaders were faced with a decision: are we gonna to sign treaties and enter into agreements or not? And our people decided, our leaders decided to enter into these treaties, giving up sovereign control over the territories, so allowing the United States to exert its jurisdiction within our territories, but reserving rights to use and harvest our land, maintain a separate existence. And you know, in the Treaty of 1854, there was an agreement that the tribes would have reservations within our territory. So these are permanent homelands where people still live. And you know, as we all know, and this, you know, this was really highlighted in Sean Sherman's presentation, which was great. While the states agreed in the treaties that they would allow a separate existence, what happened was really different. And in the context of our people and our off-reservation treaty rights, states in the 1900s adopted fish and game laws that criminalized our harvesting activities and failed to recognize our traditional governments. And the purpose of this, one of the purposes, was to disconnect our people from these areas, from these places. At the same time these fish and game laws were adopted, state and federal governments adopted a lot of laws around food production, and the sale of wild harvested foods was generally prohibited. So our people were fighting against this continually. And in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the tribes' rights were vindicated in the federal court. And so at this point, what we have for Glifwick member tribes is that our tribes have, you know, our self-government authority has been recognized by the courts. And so as long as the tribes effectively regulate our harvesting activities to protect the legitimate state interests of conservation, health, and safety, that the tribes maintain that, you know, that authority to enact and enforce their own conservation laws. At the same time, you know, tribes have also regained civil regulatory jurisdiction over on-reservation activities. And, you know, this is the Bryant decision, and which led to the creation of our casinos, and we have our, you know, the civil regulatory authority over children, tribal children, has been recognized by the courts. And so there's been a lot of movement in many different areas related to tribes' ability to self-regulate. But issues of food production have not been entirely resolved. So I'm gonna go back to our particular project again now. What we did, our approach to beginning this project was to look at kind of the foundations in three different areas. So the first area is tribal customary practices around food. How are tribal members harvesting and processing their foods? What safety practices are in place already? And what is tribal law around specific foods? So I gave you the example of maple syrup, and there's a lot of law, and there's customary law around these foods. Much of this is not necessarily it's not necessarily recognized as law in a certain way, but it's, you know, these customary practices are law. And there's certainly standards and practices that are passed along through generations, and you know, and again, these laws and the way that these foods have been harvested and consumed and processed are, you know, are the foundation of our tribal sovereignty in a very literal sense. So another area, the second area that we talked about, or that we explored, is sort of environmental and biological information on sort of a Western theoretical, science level, hypo-theoretical science. So what are the food safety risks that are associated with these foods in the categories of chemical, biological, and physical risks? We looked at what has been published about these risks, and then what research would be needed. And in the second year of the project, our environmental biologist collected and analyzed a lot of that, a lot of material and data related to those foods. Okay, so this is like a more of a discussion question. Okay, definitely. Let's I'll address that discussion question in a little bit. And then the third thing that we looked at, and my first year intern Hannah Johnson is on the line, and so like that third prong that we looked at is just the legal and regulatory context. And so how are various types of foods regulated by tribal, state, federal agencies, and then internationally with respect to the Codex Alimentarius? So Hannah really did some fundamental research into these areas. And what is the current status of wild harvested foods in state, tribal, federal, and international law right now? Oops, sorry about that. So, what we did is we created this model food code. Here's the organizational structure. It's written in English. It's written in a format that state and federal regulators are going to be able to understand, with a lot of the language that is used by these food regulators right now. And what we did was we created these corollary food safety standards for the processing of these 16 Ojibwe foods. And these foods were identified within our communities through surveys that we conducted in the first year of this project. And if you know anything about our feasting, our ceremonial practices, these are really important foods to the to our cultural traditions. And many, like all these foods, are subject to stories and teachings, and are very much present within our ceremonial practices, and they're also very, very healthy foods. And so, the model food code was also, it addresses risk that was identified within the research. And what we wanted to do is make it no more restrictive than state or federal regulations, but really, again, create kind of this corollary construct that would be not entirely foreign to state or federal regulators, and people who are administering federal food programs. And as an example, I want to talk about how we sort of married these different concepts of tribal law and science and the federal standards. So this is a picture of my little guy, my son, when we were starting to boil some sap. As a part of this project, I tried to participate in all the seasonal rounds, and made my kids do it with me. So, one of the we have standards on labeling within the model food code. And so with respect to labeling, only syrup that consists entirely of maple sap that was condensed into syrup by heating the sap over a wood burning fire can be labeled as traditionally processed maple syrup. And so, that goes back to the Atazokan about how the Anishinaabe have to work hard with processing maple syrup. Maple syrup can be processed in a food plant, and you could use gas fired equipment, and you know, many processors don't even haul buckets or you know, or engage in any, or use a wood fired burning stove to process their maple syrup. But really, there's traditional law that tells us in a really specific way how we're supposed to do things. In 2015, the FDA came out with some regulations on PHMSA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And, you know, there's some language in here that's been kind of, it's problematic to maple syrup producers. As I said, you know, Ojibwe law requires that people work for the food, and things are done in a certain and specific way. So the guidance came out on maple syrup within, or the specific guidance on maple syrup is that the processing of maple sap has to occur within a food, you know, within a food processing facility that's registered with the FDA. And so, you know, when you talk about a food, you know, this type of, you know, a food processing facility that's registered with the FDA, then the GMPs that apply to these facilities come into play as well. And, you know, our facilities for processing wild rice, this is a low risk food, and many of the tribal processors don't have facilities and should not be required to have facilities that are consistent with a food processing plant. So, you know, this brings us to some of the food safety research and the scientific research that Glyphwit put together and really conducted around these in this area. And so in the second year of the program, one of the projects that was conducted by the environmental biologist was to collect samples of maple sap for heavy metals analysis, which is a chemical risk that could be associated with a food. And really what was found is that there's no chemical risks to, you know, to producing maple syrup or maple sugar from sap, as long as the materials that are used for collection and processing are food safe and don't contain lead soldered items. And then, you know, the food safety review conducted by the community dietitian also concluded that there's really no biological chemical risk as long as the product has a degree of bricks. So this is the water quality standard that is a maximum of 66 degrees. And so really maple syrup is a low risk food. It's an indigenous food, and our people have the knowledge about how to create it. So I'm going to look at, okay. All right. And so what we did to kind of put all these things together is create definitions related to sugar and syrup that incorporate the sugar content that is, you know, that's consistent with maintaining a safe product that's not going to mold. And then, you know, in terms of making sure that to address the food, you know, the food, oh, I forgot one little part. Okay. And so then further in that FDA guidance, sorry about this, I'm gonna go back to this FDA guidance. Further in that FDA guidance is the fact that certain production areas are exempt from registering because they are because of the location of the oh, I forgot to put that in there. I'm sorry. Okay, never mind. So certain facilities are exempt from the standards on registration under the FDA because they're conducted in a residence. And so what we did to address that processing standard is that, you know, for these sugar and sap products, a final boiling and packaging of the product. So a final boiling and packaging would mean that the product is brought up to a temperature that's going to address any kind of biological concern. And, you know, packaging is conducted in a way, like the packaging standards are that the packages have to be food safe and clean. And so this final packaging and boiling, it has to occur in either a licensed food processing plant or within premises that are exempt from registering as a food facility. So, you know, if people have questions about that, I can talk about this more. Sometimes I get kind of deep into this project, but I mean, it's really about, you know, this whole project has been about kind of marrying these, looking at various different, you know, looking at our TEK, looking at the products, looking at the risks associated with the products, looking at the already existing standards that are on the federal and state levels, and then using, you know, thinking through how these kinds of processes can occur in a way that makes sense for our tribal producers. And that is, you know, that's the end of my presentation. I'd be really happy to take questions from people. You know, just to let you know, this project is going to be complete in October. So, well, technically the end of September. And all the materials, all the reports that we've created, and the code itself, the HACCP plans, the information on standard sanitation operating procedures, all those materials are going to be available to share outside of our, I mean, within our Glyphic member tribes, but then within other communities as well. And, you know, my personal goal is to, you know, I really hope that this is helpful for tribal communities in kind of pushing the envelope and providing opportunities for us to really implement these, implement programs around traditional foods and get more traditional foods into our communities. And, you know, I think that there would be ways for other non-Ojibwe tribes to take a look at this process and the codes that we came up with and adapt them and adopt them within their own communities. So I think, okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, let me answer it. Let me talk about this first question. Yeah, I mean, I think this project isn't really going to address questions about like federal recognition. And I mean, I think that's a real concern for, you know, for communities that don't have the federal recognition.
I'm sorry, Phoebe, what was the question?
So additional layers of complexity exist here in the Southeast because many of us are not federally recognized due to many factors, including the fact that the United States did not recognize us as previous colonial powers did. And then there's, you know, a lot of just historical circumstances, not having federal recognition is a huge impediment sometimes to getting funding or organizing. And I mean, I think, yeah, it would be, I think that would be a really a significant impediment to the establishment of tribal law as well, that's recognized by other jurisdictions. So, you know, this project really isn't intended to address that, but you know, certainly, I mean, I think one takeaway is this, you know, is the idea that in your, you know, in your federal recognition process, and in that, you know, in that struggle, you're collecting tribal history and stories. And I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, the stories and the traditions around food production are really important to think about, and they're legitimate, and you know, they form a really significant part of your tribal law and your tribal economy. And so, I mean, I would hope that in your tribal recognition process that your community is making sure to include analysis and the preservation of those really important foodways that you have as a distinct people.
Thank you, Philomena. This has been really informative. This is Tikon speaking again. Earlier, you were sharing about you said as long as tribes legitimately regulate the harvesting practices, they'll maintain the sovereignty to do so. I'm wondering if you, in the project that you've done, have explored what legitimately really means, or if that was like a sticking point of the verbiage for the government, and is the food code a reflection of that legitimate practice and regulation? Declared.
Okay. Here, so it's. I'll go back to that particular slide if I can. So it's not it's just slow today, my computer. All right, and so, you know, the legitimate part comes in this area of the legitimate state conservation, health, and safety interests. And so, you know, how that relates to this particular project is that, you know, certainly states have a legitimate interest in making sure that food that's available for sale is not, you know, it's safe, wholesome, it's labeled in a correct manner, in a truthful way, that, you know, that people have the correct nutritional information about the food that they're consuming, and, you know, and that food has been processed in a way that maintains its integrity, right? And so those are the standards around like adulteration and, you know, labeling standards, misbranding, things like that, you know. And so certainly those are legitimate state interests. And those are legitimate state interests that tribal communities also share. You know, I've never, people, you know, like tribal people are just as careful with the food as anybody else, you know. And every time that I've been to a feast and I've eaten, especially in Bad River, all of our food is, you know, is prepared in a really healthy way, and that, you know, people really make sure that the food that they're providing and they're putting out for other people to eat is safe and wholesome and not, you know, dirty or adulterated or anything like that. So, you know, that's certainly a really, you know, that's certainly a component that's within the food code that we've created, and it's really emphasized. There's a provision on standard sanitation operating procedures. There's a whole chapter on HACCP, and HACCP applies to those foods that have to be produced within a food processing plant, like meat and fish that would be either prepared for a retail sale or prepared to go in a federal program. And so, I think it, there's that's really the approach that we've taken to address, those legitimate state concerns about those food codes. And again, I mean, we're using a lot of the same language that federal regulators have. But then within the project itself, we're creating model HACCP plans for harvesters and for food plants, so they wouldn't have to create everything from scratch, because food, processing food for retail is really complicated, especially with PHMSA and all the new regulations and like everything that's happened within the last 10 years around food, and produce. It's all sort of new, but what we've tried to do is adapt a lot of these concepts, these federal law concepts, in a way that can be implemented in a tribal community, and specific to foods that are harvested in the wild.
Amazing. Thank you for answering that so thoroughly. That was really informative. And it kind of leads into my next question I had for you, which was, you talked about using some of the language that was provided by the federal government to inform the food code to make sure that it was in alignment with those expectations. I'm curious about if you can share some of the challenges when translating the traditional values shared through the oral traditions, and how you honored those, and if there was difficulty in capturing that and having it reflected in the code.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I won't answer your question directly, but so one of the big challenges with this particular project was wild game, because there are federal and state regulations that prohibit the sale of wild game. And wild game is considered non-amenable, and there's really, it's a pretty, it's been a part of, like I said in my presentation, this has been a fixture within food law for more than 100 years. And so, I mean, what we did with the wild game portion of it is that, it wouldn't work for our communities. It's to transport your wild animal into a slaughtering facility, because, I mean, that's really inconsistent with the respect that people have and the teachings that people have around wild food. There's a lot of teachings that we get about how to respectfully hunt food, and you put down your tobacco and you respect their life, and so it took quite a bit of thinking to figure out how we were going to address that particular issue. But if you take a look at the standards that are issued by FSIS on post-mortem inspections, pre-mortem inspections that are required for any kind of wild animal that is sold in a like retail market or whatever, the what these inspectors are looking for is pretty basic, and it's certainly like if the animal has to be ambulatory, so that means it has to stand up on its two legs and it can't be showing symptoms of blindness or motor control issues or things like that. And those standards are really in place to address risks related to bovine spongiform encephalopathy. But those are checks that any tribal harvester does without thinking. I mean, they're not going to be harvesting a deer that can't stand up. And so, we created a process whereby every harvester has to certify that the deer that they harvested doesn't exhibit symptoms that are consistent with BSE. CWD would be like the corollary kind of disease, and certainly CWD, chronic wasting disease, would create neurological symptoms that would prevent, that can prevent a deer from standing up and, being really skinny and all kinds of things. So you have to, like, the deer that you're harvesting has to be healthy, and that's what people do anyway. But they have to certify that because, under all our, like the food safety regime, documentation is really important. So we're creating that documentation requirement, and without documentation, the deer can't be sold to or brought into a food processing facility that's licensed by the tribe. And and then the whatever field dressing occurs, it has to occur while the animal is on a clean and cleanable surface. And this could be a game processing table, this could be a clean and sterilized tarp. But that's another way of ensuring that there's parity between wild harvesting and slaughtering in a slaughterhouse, because of surfaces and surfaces that are going to be around the animal and touch the animal. It's important to control the environment, and any tools that are used have to be clean, cleanable, and sterilized. And there has to be records around all that kinds of stuff. And so this is the way that we have thought about how we can go about making a corollary regulation that will address the concerns, the overall concerns of the of these food and these health safety standards. The animal welfare standards are about ensuring that the product is wholesome and it's not dirty, and it's not gonna have a biological issues, anything like that. I mean, in like the federal meat standards, we were looking for a long time about how long a processor has to cool down a carcass, but that regulation doesn't exist in federal law because the meat processors push back on that. And so what's required is continuous cooling. And that's, that's a standard that we also adopted within the food code that we created. And, in addition to document the measures that are taken to ensure that the cooling took place. So any kind of concerns related to E. coli or other sorts of biological time and temperature control issues are properly addressed in the overall processing of the animal.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing the example. I think is really helpful.
It's like, I'm sorry for so many words. It's like blah, blah, blah over here, but it's complicated, and it's like, it's been a big project.
Yeah, absolutely. The complexity of the requirements is a huge undertaking to understand. Nonetheless, create a document that can help, guide the tribal regulation and sovereignty around ownership of food. So it's incredible what you all have accomplished, and I'm really excited to see, what where it can be taken and how it can be adopted by the tribes and by nationwide, really. And in Alaska, a lot of the things that you shared is really relevant to our story and our conversation. The wild game processing and how do we create more access to it in communities that might not be able to harvest a moose or something. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting what Alaska's doing with respect to getting, like with implementing the Alaska state law on, around wild harvested foods, and, the recognition that these foods are really critical for the health of people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I worked in healthcare prior to joining IAC, and I was just so excited to see that at the Alaska Native Medical Center that serves Alaska Native people, it's an inpatient hospital. The executive chef and the food program there has incorporated and donated traditional meats. And so they have served seal and they have served caribou, and they're making fry bread. I know fry bread's not necessarily traditional, but it is a treat, that everyone loves. So just to have those traditional foods in a healthcare facility is amazing. And, it's really happening across the state in a lot of our residential programs. So, and I think what you've done here with the food code will help to further that access and maintain ownership of, our food systems and really support it. Tribes across the nation in accomplishing that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's definitely been a really big effort, on the part of Glyphwick, and we've gotten a lot of feedback and participation and input from our tribal communities, and so this is really a reflection of our tribal communities, and the emphasis that they have on the importance of these traditional foods. Like, they're really important for for our continued health.
Absolutely. It heals more than just the body, to eat the foods that we have, and the practice of harvesting even feel very strongly about that. So I really appreciate
many of our foods are, they're indicator species, and so you can't, like, your water quality, if you have wild rice growing there, your water quality is pristine, right? It's really good. So having, I mean, I think another aspect of this, maybe another aspect of this work that we're doing, is the fact that we want we want non-Native people also to understand and appreciate the value of these foods and how important they are to the world, and to our world community, and then help us protect these places and these environments where our food grows.
Absolutely. And I think food is a great catalyst for that conversation, and to recognize that we need to protect these wild places that are still wild and producing food, and it's a right to have access to those traditional foods, and it needs to be protected. So I really appreciate you being here today and sharing all of your knowledge and doing this deep dive into the project that you guys have accomplished and are finishing up after 3 years. It's been really informative, and I've really loved hearing about it and learning about the work that you've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for those that are still watching, please check out the webinars that'll continue throughout the week, and join us on Saturday for the whole live summit. You can join right from your home. The virtual summit will be streaming all day, and so please check it out and join us. Really looking forward to it, and a lot of good work has gone into creating the different webinars and pulling together the roundtables, and I'm really excited. It's guaranteed to be really informative and fun. So thank you all for joining today. With that, I'm going to end this call. Thank you, everyone.